In September of 1944, the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division told his men, with total confidence, that the small coral island of Peleliu would be secured within 4 days. Marines who had already fought through Guadalcanal and New Britain took him at his word, packed light, and prepared for a short, sharp fight before moving on to the next objective in the Long Island hopping campaign toward Japan. The battle for Peleliu lasted more than 2 months. By the time it finally ended, one Marine regiment had suffered casualty rates exceeding 60% of its men, and historians, and even some of the very generals who ordered the assault, would spend the following decades debating whether the island needed to be taken at all. This is the story of what happened to the Marines who survived Peleliu, a battle so costly and so strategically questionable that it remains, even today, one of the most controversial fights of the entire Pacific War. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How does a mission predicted to take 4 days turn into a 2-month nightmare fought over jagged coral ridges? And what does it mean for the men who survive a battle that decades later, historians still argue should never have been fought at all? The broader strategic context surrounding the Peleliu decision reflected a genuine and, in retrospect, deeply consequential disagreement within American Pacific Command about how aggressively to pursue every intermediate objective standing between American forces and the Japanese home islands. Some senior naval commanders had, in fact, argued before the operation that Peleliu might not need to be assaulted at all, that its garrison could simply be bypassed and left isolated, a position that gained additional weight when reconnaissance flights conducted just before the operation's launch suggested Japanese defensive preparations on the island were more extensive than earlier assessments had indicated. This objection did not prevail, and the operation proceeded largely as originally planned, a decision that historians examining the campaign's planning process have continued to scrutinize as one of the more consequential missed opportunities to avoid one of the war's costliest and most controversial engagements. The Palau Island group where Peleliu sits had held strategic significance for American planners primarily because of its position relative to the broader Philippine Sea and the approaches Japanese naval and air forces might use to interfere with MacArthur's planned Philippines campaign, a calculation that placed Peleliu's capture within a chain of interlocking strategic considerations, spanning an enormous geographic area, even though the island itself, considered purely in isolation, offered relatively modest direct value, beyond the airfield American planners specifically wanted secured. Peleliu, a small island in the Palau group barely 6 miles long, was targeted in September of 1944, primarily because American planners believed its airfield needed to be secured to protect the flank of General Douglas MacArthur's much larger and more strategically significant return to the Philippines, scheduled to begin at almost exactly the same time. Major General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division for the assault, based his 4-day prediction on preliminary intelligence assessments and the assumption that heavy naval and aerial bombardment in the days before the landing would substantially destroy Japanese defensive positions, an assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong almost from the moment Marines actually set foot on the beach. What American intelligence failed to fully appreciate was that Japan's defensive doctrine had fundamentally changed since earlier Pacific battles. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commanding Peleliu's garrison, abandoned the traditional Japanese approach of contesting the beach landing directly, a tactic that had produced dramatic but ultimately unsustainable casualties against American firepower in earlier battles. Instead, Nakagawa withdrew the bulk of his forces into an extraordinary network of caves and tunnels carved into the island's jagged coral ridges, a terrain feature known as the Umubrogol that offered natural defensive advantages no amount of preliminary naval bombardment could meaningfully destroy, since shells and bombs exploding against solid coral rock and deep cave systems inflicted only a fraction of the damage they would have caused against more conventional above-ground fortifications. The Umerbrogel's cave system itself represented a remarkable feat of defensive engineering, constructed and reinforced over months by Japanese labor working with limited equipment in punishing tropical heat, connecting hundreds of individual caves and fighting positions through tunnels that allowed defenders to move between locations without exposing themselves to American observation or fire from above. Some of these caves had been naturally occurring formations in the island's coral limestone, widened and reinforced with concrete and steel to create multi-level defensive positions capable of housing artillery pieces, machine gun nests, and supply stores, all protected from direct fire weapons and largely immune to anything short of a direct hit from the heaviest naval guns available. The preliminary bombardment that American commanders had believed would soften Japanese defenses to the point of collapse instead expended enormous quantities of naval ammunition against targets that were, in the most literal sense, already empty, since Nakagawa's forces had withdrawn into the caves specifically to avoid exactly this kind of surface bombardment. Naval gunfire officers overseeing the preliminary shelling reportedly grew concerned partway through the bombardment schedule that they were running short of appropriate targets to strike, an assessment that, in hindsight, should have been a warning sign that the island's actual defensive strength remained almost entirely intact and hidden rather than destroyed. But this concern did not translate into any fundamental reassessment of the assault timeline or the 4-day prediction guiding the operations planning. The initial landing itself, while less catastrophically disrupted than the tidal disaster that had nearly doomed the Tarawa assault a year earlier, still encountered significant difficulties as amphibious tractors and landing craft struggled against a coral reef surrounding much of the island, though American forces had, by this stage of the war, incorporated hard lessons from Tarawa specifically into their landing craft allocation and reef reconnaissance procedures, avoiding a repeat of that earlier disaster even as an entirely different and, in its own way, equally serious defensive surprise awaited them once they actually moved inland from the beach itself. Marines who landed on Peleliu's beaches on September 15th encountered resistance far more organized and sustained than the largely destroyed defensive network they had been led to expect, and the fighting's character shifted rapidly from a conventional beach assault into something closer to a prolonged siege against an enemy fighting from positions that could not be seen, targeted, or destroyed using the tactics and firepower that had worked reasonably well against more conventional Japanese defenses in earlier Pacific battles. Medical evacuation and treatment under these conditions presented its own significant challenges, since the jagged, cave-riddled terrain made it extremely difficult to move wounded Marines safely to aid stations, and corpsmen attending to casualties in the field frequently found themselves exposed to the same interlocking fields of fire that had wounded the men they were trying to treat in the first place. The combination of extreme heat, physical exhaustion, and the specific difficulty of extracting casualties from steep, broken coral terrain meant that even wounds that might have been readily survivable under more conventional battlefield conditions elsewhere in the Pacific sometimes proved fatal at Peleliu simply because of how long and how dangerous the process of reaching definitive medical care actually was. The oil-contaminated water crisis in the battle's opening days deserves particular attention because it illustrates just how completely the operations planning had failed to anticipate the actual conditions Marines would face. Water had been shipped ashore in empty fuel drums that had not been adequately cleaned before reuse, and Marines already suffering from extreme heat exhaustion and dehydration found themselves drinking water that induced nausea and vomiting, compounding the physical toll of combat with a logistical failure that should have been entirely preventable. Supply officers worked to correct the problem within the first several days, but the initial period of contaminated water compounded the already severe physical strain, the tropical heat and jagged terrain were placing on every Marine fighting through the island's interior. Stop and consider what this actually meant for the individual Marine fighting through the Umurbrogul's ridges in the weeks that followed, because the tactical reality bore almost no resemblance to the 4-day operation Marines had been told to expect. The terrain itself became as dangerous an adversary as the Japanese defenders occupying it. Jagged coral formations that shredded boots and equipment, temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit with almost no natural shade, and a water supply that, in the battle's earliest and most desperate days, arrived in drums that had previously held fuel oil, contaminating drinking water with a residue that made already exhausted, dehydrated Marines physically ill from the very water meant to keep them alive. A specific ridge complex that Marines came to call Bloody Nose Ridge, part of the broader Umurbrogul system, became emblematic of the entire battle's brutal character. A position fought over repeatedly across multiple days, with casualties accumulating at a rate that shocked veteran Marine officers who had already fought through earlier, comparably intense engagements elsewhere in the Pacific. The ridge's name itself, adopted by the Marines fighting there rather than assigned by any official designation, captured the grim, matter-of-fact humor combat veterans frequently developed to process experiences that defied more conventional description, a linguistic pattern that shows up repeatedly across first-hand accounts of the fighting throughout the Umurbrogul's interconnected ridgelines. Every ridge, every cave mouth, every seemingly cleared position had to be assaulted individually, often multiple times, because Japanese defenders frequently withdrew deeper into interconnected tunnel systems rather than dying in a single position, allowing them to reoccupy supposedly secured ground once American forces moved past it, a tactical pattern that meant Marines could never be entirely certain that ground behind their own lines was actually as secure as it appeared. Flamethrowers and demolition charges became the primary tools for reducing cave positions one at a time. Brutal, close-range fighting that exposed the Marines conducting it to some of the highest individual casualty risk of the entire campaign. Nakagawa did not survive the battle to give his own extensive first-hand account of the defense he had organized, dying during the campaign's final phase as organized Japanese resistance collapsed. A death that, combined with the destruction or loss of much of the garrison's own written records during the fighting, has left historians reconstructing his specific tactical decision-making primarily through the physical evidence of the defensive positions themselves, surviving fragments of Japanese military correspondence, and the accounts of the small number of Japanese personnel who did survive the battle as prisoners. Nakagawa himself, according to post-war Japanese accounts and the limited surviving documentation from the garrison's own records, appears to have understood from the outset that his defense could not ultimately prevent the island's eventual capture, framing his mission, instead, around inflicting the maximum possible cost on American forces and delaying their broader Pacific timeline for as long as his position and supplies allowed. A strategic reframing away from the impossible goal of victory toward the more achievable goal of maximizing attrition, a doctrine that would be applied with even greater scale and sophistication at Iwo Jima under General Kuribayashi's similar defensive philosophy months later. Nakagawa's defensive doctrine at Peleliu represented a deliberate and, from a purely tactical standpoint, remarkably effective evolution in how Japanese forces approached island defense, a doctrine that would be studied and refined further for the even larger and more costly defensive battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the months that followed. By abandoning the beach and withdrawing into prepared cave positions, Nakagawa ensured that American numerical and firepower advantages, which had proven decisive in destroying more conventional above-ground Japanese defenses in earlier battles, became far less effective against an enemy that could not be easily located, targeted, or dislodged through the same combination of naval gunfire and infantry assault that had worked previously. Naval and Marine Corps air support. coordinated closely with the ground fighting throughout the campaign, played its own significant role in the slow process of reducing the Umabrogol's defenses, with aircraft dropping napalm and heavy bombs directly onto ridge positions in an attempt to supplement the ground-level flamethrower, and demolition tactics being used to clear individual caves. Though air support against deeply dug-in cave positions proved to have similar fundamental limitations to the preliminary naval bombardment that had failed to meaningfully weaken Japanese defenses before the initial landing, underscoring just how difficult this specific type of fortified cave defense was to overcome through firepower alone, regardless of whether that firepower came from naval guns, artillery, or aircraft. American infantry and combat engineers developed increasingly specialized and coordinated tactics over the course of the battle, specifically to counter this cave-based defensive network. Techniques that combined flamethrower teams, demolition charges, and close infantry support in a methodical process of sealing and destroying individual cave entrances one at a time. An approach that, while eventually effective, required extraordinarily dangerous close-range work by the Marines and engineers conducting it, since approaching a cave entrance to place a demolition charge or direct a flamethrower's stream meant exposing oneself directly to whatever defenders remained inside at point-blank range. Japanese defenders holding these cave positions fought with the same commitment to resistance until death that had characterized Japanese defense in earlier Pacific battles. But the specific terrain and defensive architecture at Peleliu meant this commitment translated into a far longer and more costly campaign for American forces than the more exposed, conventional defenses of earlier battles had produced. Surviving Japanese accounts and post-war analysis of the battle describe Nakagawa's forces conducting a genuinely sophisticated, methodical defense, rather than simply a static, hopeless final stand, using the cave network's interconnections to reposition forces, ambush American units that believed an area had already been cleared, and extend the battle's duration far beyond what the island's small size and the size of the defending garrison might otherwise have suggested was possible. General Rupertus himself, whose 4-day prediction had shaped the entire operation's planning and resource allocation, faced considerable post-war and even contemporary criticism for his initial assessment and for his reported reluctance to accept, even as the battle's actual duration and cost became apparent, that his original prediction had been fundamentally mistaken. A command posture some historians have suggested delayed the decision to bring in Army reinforcements and additional resources that might have reduced Marine casualties had they been requested earlier in the campaign. This dynamic, a commanding officer's initial confident prediction becoming increasingly disconnected from an unfolding battlefield reality, represents one of the more uncomfortable command dimensions of the Peleliu story that post-war historical analysis has continued to examine closely. The human cost of this extended, grinding battle fell with particular severity on specific Marine units that bore the brunt of the fighting through the Umabrogol's most heavily defended positions, most notably the 1st Marine Regiment, which suffered casualty rates so severe by the battle's later weeks that it was withdrawn from the fighting entirely, replaced by fresh Army infantry units, brought in specifically because the Marine units originally assigned to the operation had been rendered combat ineffective by the sheer scale of losses sustained fighting through terrain that offered the defenders every conceivable advantage, and the attackers almost none. What made Sledge's eventual memoir so significant to later historians was not simply its detail, but its unusual psychological candor, describing his own fear, exhaustion, and moments of moral discomfort with a directness that many earlier combat memoirs, shaped by the more restrained literary conventions and social expectations of the immediate post-war decades, had generally avoided, offering readers and historians alike a rare, unfiltered window into the actual lived experience of infantry combat in the Pacific, rather than a more polished or heroic retrospective account. Sledge's own path to authorship was itself unusual among combat memoirists of his generation, since he did not initially set out to write for publication at all, instead compiling detailed personal notes and recollections over many years primarily as a private record for himself and his family, before eventually being persuaded by historians and colleagues who recognized the extraordinary value of his unusually detailed and psychologically candid observations to prepare the material for wider publication, a process that took place decades after the events themselves had occurred, long enough that Sledge could reflect on his combat experience with a perspective that immediate post-war accounts, often written within months or a few years of the fighting, could not yet fully achieve. Eugene Sledge, a young Marine mortarman who fought through Peleliu and later through Okinawa as well, would go on to write one of the most detailed and psychologically honest first-hand memoirs of Pacific combat ever published, an account that described Peleliu specifically as an experience that stripped away any romantic notion of combat entirely, replacing it with an unflinching record of exhaustion, terror, and the specific, grinding horror of fighting for weeks in terrain and conditions that offered no meaningful relief or respite between engagements. Sledge's account, published decades after the war, became one of the primary sources historians and the general public alike relied upon to understand not just the tactical details of the battle, but the genuine psychological toll it exacted on the men who fought through it. Beyond the 1st Marine Regiment specifically, the broader 1st Marine Division as a whole emerged from Peleliu so severely depleted that it required an extended period of rest, reconstitution, and replacement before it could be considered ready for further major combat operations. A recovery period that removed one of the Marine Corps' most experienced and battle-tested divisions from the active order of battle for the Pacific campaign's next several months, at exactly the point in the war when every available combat-ready unit carried real strategic weight for the operations still to come against the Philippines and, eventually, the Japanese home islands themselves. By the time organized Japanese resistance on Peleliu finally collapsed in late November of 1944, more than 2 months after Rupertus's 4-day prediction, American forces had sustained casualties, killed and wounded combined, numbering in the thousands, a toll that, relative to the island's small size and limited strategic value, prompted serious and sustained post-war debate among historians and even some of the American military leadership involved in planning the operation about whether Peleliu's capture had actually been necessary at all. Admiral William Halsey, whose broader Pacific command included input into the operational planning surrounding Peleliu, reportedly expressed doubts of his own about the necessity of a direct assault even before the operation began. Doubts that, like the earlier reconnaissance-based objections raised within Naval Command, did not ultimately alter the operation's course. A pattern of expressed reservations followed by unchanged execution that recurs throughout the documented planning history of this specific battle, and that continues to draw historians' attention as an illustrative case study in how military bureaucracies sometimes proceed with a planned operation despite internal doubts about its necessity, once significant resources and institutional momentum have already been committed to it. Some strategic assessments conducted after the war concluded that the island could have been bypassed entirely, its garrison left to wither, without resupply, as American forces continued their advance elsewhere, a strategic option that, had it been chosen, might have avoided the battle's catastrophic casualty toll without meaningfully affecting the broader Pacific campaign's overall timeline or success. The Army's 81st Infantry Division, brought in to relieve exhausted Marine units and eventually to complete the reduction of the Umabrogol's final defensive pockets, conducted its own extended and costly fighting through the battle's later weeks, a contribution to the overall Peleliu campaign that receives comparatively little attention in popular accounts of the battle, which tend to focus overwhelmingly on the Marine Corps' role and casualties specifically. Despite the Army's substantial and sustained involvement in finishing the campaign's final, grinding phases against the last organized pockets of Japanese resistance in the island's most inaccessible terrain. Perhaps the most remarkable and little-known postscript to the entire battle involves a small group of Japanese soldiers who continued fighting from Peleliu's cave systems for years after the war's official end. Holdouts who, isolated in the island's interior and disconnected from any reliable news of Japan's surrender, continued resisting until 1947, when a Japanese admiral traveled to the island specifically to convince the remaining holdouts that the war had genuinely ended, and that continued resistance served no purpose. A resolution that arrived nearly 2 full years after the fighting that had originally cost so many American and Japanese lives had officially concluded. The near-total overshadowing of Peleliu by MacArthur's Philippines landing was not merely a matter of unfortunate timing, but reflected a deliberate media and public relations calculation by American military leadership, since MacArthur's return to the Philippines carried enormous symbolic and propaganda value tied to his own famous promise to return. A narrative American commanders and war correspondents were eager to promote heavily in newspapers and newsreels back home, leaving comparatively little public attention or column space for a smaller, more tactically obscure battle unfolding simultaneously on an island most Americans had never heard of, and, in the campaign's aftermath, would struggle to locate on a map. For the Marines who survived Peleliu, the battle's relative obscurity in broader public memory, overshadowed at the time by the far larger and more publicly celebrated return of American forces to the Philippines happening almost simultaneously, added its own particular and lasting frustration to the post-war experience of survivors who had fought through one of the most brutal engagements of the entire Pacific War, only to find it received a fraction of the public recognition given to battles of comparable or even lesser individual cost. Post-war veterans organizations, specifically composed of Peleliu survivors, worked, in the decades following the war, to preserve and publicize the battle's history precisely because they recognized how easily it might otherwise fade from public memory entirely. Organizing reunions, contributing oral histories to military archives, and supporting the eventual publication of accounts like Sledge's, specifically to ensure that a battle so costly in human terms would not simply disappear into the broader, less individually examined narrative of the Pacific War's many island campaigns. This relative obscurity, combined with the genuine and ongoing historical debate over whether the battle had been strategically necessary at all, left many Peleliu survivors carrying a specific and particular burden beyond the ordinary psychological weight of combat. A lingering uncertainty about whether the losses they had witnessed and the friends they had lost had actually purchased anything of lasting strategic value, a question that, unlike the more clearly justified sacrifices of other Pacific battles, historians have never fully or conclusively resolved. Remember the question this story opened with: how does a 4-day mission turn into a 2-month nightmare? And what does it mean for the men who survive a battle historians still debate should never have been fought? The honest answer is that the transformation happened almost entirely because of a single, compounding intelligence and doctrinal failure, underestimating how completely Japan's defensive approach had evolved, and that the men who survived it carried forward not just the ordinary weight of combat trauma, but a specific and unusual burden. Knowing that the friends they lost and the suffering they endured occurred in a battle whose strategic necessity their own country's military historians would spend decades afterward openly questioning, a weight that few other Pacific War veterans were asked to carry alongside their own memories of combat. If you want to understand how a battle predicted to take 4 days became one of the bloodiest and most strategically questioned engagements of the entire Pacific War, and what that uncertainty meant for the Marines who survived fighting through it. This is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.